So I'm going to throw a few worldly terms out there that I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with. And I'm going to give you their definitions, which you already have the definitions probably in your mind already. And these are the definitions that are according to Webster's New World Dictionary. So you may look at it and say, wow, I know what my view of these or my definition of these words were, but I'm kind of interested in seeing what Webster has to say in his New World Dictionary. So the first term I'm going to talk about, or just for a second here, the word or the term policy. Policy means wise management. And all these words are related to each other from the same root. The second is also P-O-L, starting. It's called politics. It's another word. And it's the science of government management. Sound familiar? You probably have seen these first two and recognized that these pretty much represent what your thoughts are. But then we see the third one is police, coming from the same word or the same term. It's the entity that enforces government policy. And how about this word? The word politicians. The word politicians. Now, the second word politics and the fourth word politicians may get your thoughts going in a certain direction. But let's see then what Webster says the definition of politicians is. These are ones actively engaged in politics, often used with implications of seeking personal or partisan gain, scheming, etc. This is from Webster's dictionary, which may line up with whenever you heard the word or hear the word politician, that might be what you come up with. In fact, often when we hear the word politician, we tend to think of someone who is self-serving, phony, and arrogant. That's the natural tendency that we seem to have with that term in our culture today. But God established governments under human leadership for the glory of God and the good of mankind. This is out of Romans 13, beginning in the very beginning of the chapter, verse 1. God established government for the sake of glorifying himself and for the good of the people. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, didn't you just tell me about politicians might be wanting to get personal gain? So this is the dilemma we have. The government and the leadership in government was supposed to be for the benefit of glorifying God and the benefit of other people. So what we see then is that it's gotten so flipped upside down that leadership is not trusted in our culture today. And the whole reason is because mankind is corrupt. Romans 3:10-23, you know that. But God's plan still stands, and he has called people to be in positions of leadership anyway. He's ordained this. And we see then in the context of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, the male leadership is the focus of this chapter, specifically pastors and elders, yet generally for all men regarding their leadership roles as husbands and fathers. And so while leaders have a bad name, God still calls us to be in certain positions of leadership. And so with this, 1 Thessalonians 2:4-6 is what we're going to be looking at today, then shows three attitudes of a godly leader that will help you to lead and follow according to your role. Last week we looked at three actions, and this time we're going to look at three attitudes that of a godly leader that will help you to lead and follow according to your role. What does that mean? How will it help you to follow? Because you will recognize a leader that's doing what he's supposed to be doing, even if you don't like it. Because all of us don't want to be told what to do. But when you see what a good leader looks like, even if you don't like it, you got to either say, well, I don't like it, or I know that's what he's supposed to be doing. And so these things help you and us and men, because everybody has to submit to somebody. Everybody has to submit to somebody. So understanding what a godly leader looks like, we can then recognize that, well, I don't really like it, but God says this is what a godly leader looks like. Who are you going to go with? Your own opinion or what God says? This is what we're looking at. So this background here, we're looking at, once again, the first letter that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, where he is praising the Lord for them because they're a model church. And in chapter 1, he talks about why he sees them as a model church. He talked about their fruit that they saw in salvation, and in their salvation, in their sanctification, and even their practicing the Great Commission. They were a model church. And in chapter 2, then, Paul is showing them and us the godliness that he and his team had, and that what they demonstrated, which yielded this fruit of how well the Thessalonians were doing because of the godly leaders that they had. And so Paul is sharing that with us in chapter 2. And what we see, and we talked about last week, the context indicates that Paul may have been answering, and probably due to the context, accusations against him and his team, just like all these accusations were flying at him everywhere, but he especially deals with it in both letters to the Corinthians. And so with this, as he is giving this description of him and his team, we can see then that it's a prescription for us. He's describing what godly leaders look like. Therefore, by describing what they look like, he is prescribing that this is what we should do also to be godly leaders and to recognize godly leaders. He is showing the marks of a godly leader with 12 marks in chapter 2, all the way from verse 1 to verse 12. And we talked about the first 3 last week, as a godly leader bears produce, which is fruit. A godly leader bears persecution, meaning putting up with everybody hating him. And a godly leader bears pure truth in thought, word, and deed. And today we're going to look at then verses 4 through 6, which will show us 3 attitudes of a godly leader. First, verse 4, we see this. A godly leader bears priority. Verse 4. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. We've been approved by God, entrusted with the gospel, and therefore we speak in a manner that's not to please men, but to please God. First, we see the term or the phrase, verse 4, approved by God. And this was Paul's calling to preach the gospel. And it was solely by the grace of God. He didn't sign up for it. And we're going to see this because we're going to read through his testimony, because we talk about Paul all the time, because he wrote most of the books in the New Testament. And we went through Ephesians already. So here we're going to get some behind the scenes on this godly leader Paul and what he came from, and with that, the hope that every man in this room has, seeing what God can do through Paul, and then therefore what he can do through you. Okay, we see then that the Apostle Paul was previously known as Saul, and he was a feared Pharisee who persecuted Christians, including even participating in the murder of the first martyr, Stephen. In Acts 7:58, he stood there approving the whole stoning while he guarded the men's cloaks who were stoning him. He was in on it. He was part of it, part of the murder. And so Paul, now, when he was Saul, because his name was changed, was an enemy of Christ in his church. But then he was put into service of Christ in his church. He was an enemy that killed Christians, and now he's being put into service. How does that make anybody in this room or anybody outside feel, with the sake of there's hope for anybody, no matter how bad of a person they were? So we're going to read this. Acts chapter 9, verse 1. It gives Paul's testimony. Luke is giving us his testimony. It says here, now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anybody belonging to the way meant That was the name for Christians. It was called the Way. Both men and women, he brought them, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he was traveling, it happened that as he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Paul's like got it made. He's a rock star. He's got it all going on. He's popular. He's a big, we'll see even more about him. And he gets slammed to the ground with a big light telling him that he's not in charge. And so Paul responded as if he understood that he wasn't in charge. And this is what Paul said at Saul at the time. He said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the word Lord could mean that he was crying out to Lord God, or Lord meaning somebody that's over you. In other words, he's acknowledging, like, I'm the guy on the ground on my back, and you're the one that did it. I'm going to be addressing you as somebody greater than me. And everybody needs that attitude adjustment sometime. And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it will be told to you what you must do." So the men who stood with him, who traveled with him, stood speechless, hearing a voice but not seeing anyone. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus, and he was there 3 days without sight, and he neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him, Ananias in a vision, "Ananias," he said, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. And he," speaking of Paul, "has seen a vision of a man named Ananias come and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight." Ananias knew what was up. He'd heard of this guy from Tarsus named Saul. Verse 13, but Ananias answered, in other words, Ananias answered. You can see that there's a little bit of conflict here. Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he did to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has the authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on your name." Ananias is like, "Oh, wait. This is really confusing. This does not sound like something I want to be part of." But the Lord said to him, in other words, the but meaning, but on the other hand, this is what the Lord said, and he's the Lord. "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine." Keep this in mind. He is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him much, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my sake. So Ananias departed and entered the house, and after laying his hands on him, he says this. Really interesting. Ananias says this, "Brother Saul." Go back a minute. Brother Saul, wait. He's recognizing that the Lord's called him, and he's saying, "Brother Saul," because the Lord told him he was now his brother. "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you were coming, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he regained his sight, and he got up and was baptized, and he took some food and was strengthened. Paul knew that this is straight from Jesus, that he was approved by Jesus and put into service. It was completely obvious, and not just to Jesus, but to Ananias and anybody else that was around. He knew the truth about his credentials to be an apostle now, yet he also knew that he deserved death for his sin. He knew both of those things. He referred to himself as the foremost of all sinners in 1 Timothy 1:15. In Galatians, he introduces himself as Paul, an apostle, but then in parentheses, "not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father." I got this assignment from God. is what he's saying. I didn't get this assignment from man. I didn't bring it on myself. It's not through flesh and blood. I didn't come up with this idea myself. This was from God. He goes on then to give his testimonies. Now he gives his testimony in Galatians chapter 1, verse 11. So he's talking about a little bit more insight on his testimony. For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. Once again, what is he doing? He's pointing up. He's saying, it's not according to man. Verse 12. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former manner in life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. He's just saying, hey, you know who I am, I know who I am, and the only reason I'm here is because he sent me. I don't know what to tell you. There's no way that any man would ever choose me to do this. There's no way that I would have chosen to do this. This is from him. Verse 14. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen. I mean, this guy was like headed for the top. I mean, he was basically just about at the top. He's saying, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. Oh, what does he call it? Ancestral traditions. But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. He went to somewhere else away from man, and we understand from other contexts in the Bible that he was trained by Christ personally. Verse 18. Then, 3 years later, sound familiar? That's the same training that the other apostles got. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to be acquainted with Cephas. Who's Cephas? Peter. And stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So we see here that Paul was approved and set apart by God, and he knew it. A godly man is one who knows he has been given a job of leadership by God. If you have a child, if you have a wife, you have been appointed a position of leadership by God. You already know this. And then verse 4, not only a position of leadership, but to be entrusted with the gospel. You've been given a job to teach your children about the Lord, and you are the leader, and you can't get out of it. He's assigned you in this position, and that's the way it is. Paul says to be entrusted with the gospel about himself 5 times in just this epistle alone. This was not Paul's choice, but God's choice for him. He even talks about it in 1 Corinthians 9:17. This was a stewardship from God, and it was an honor to him, of course, because he knew who he was. He didn't deserve it. And none of you men and none of us men deserve anything. It's a privilege. It's a great honor and privilege to be approved by God when you know you're a wretched sinner saved by grace. That's your starting point in your attitude on understanding how a leader is supposed to be. Therefore, with this, not being concerned about acceptance from man. Verse 4, not as pleasing to men. The opposite of flattery. It's not seeker-friendly. It's not popular. It's not being appeasing man. Paul had said this to the Galatians. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a slave of Christ. They just don't go. It's not popular to be a slave of Christ. If you want to be appeasing men and pleasing men, then you're in the wrong business, or you're just a false teacher and a liar. Because you cannot be a man pleaser and be a slave of Christ. It's either one or the other. We see this in Galatians. Rather, this is what Paul did and his men. He preached both. Think about this for a minute. Paul preached both the good news of the gospel and the bad news about sin. He preached the whole thing. And we know, 1 Corinthians 1:18 tells us, this message is foolishness to those who are perishing. And it's not only foolishness, but it angers people when they're confronted with their sin. Acts 7:54, Stephen confronted the Jews with their sin, including Paul, and it made them really mad, and they stoned him. It's not popular to preach, and it's not popular to live the truth, and it's even deadly. So this is the motivation today, though, is people-pleasing. This is what we see today, and the Bible tells us that false teachers will attract the masses, that means a whole bunch of people, according to emotionalism. Verse 2 Timothy 4:3, this is what it says. You guys have heard these things. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires. That's what people pleasers do. And so, as we saw last week, a godly leader bears persecution and preaches the truth and refutes falsehood anyway, no matter how much it hurts. A godly leader is not going to care what mankind thinks. Let's just put it this way. As Isaiah tells us that good will be called evil and evil will be called good, the man that wants to be a godly leader will be considered the bad guy. You've heard guys say it all the time, I'm made out to be the bad guy. Now I'm the bad guy. It's exactly what would happen is good would be called evil and evil would be called good. And we see that Jesus was not a people pleaser. That's why they crucified him. He was not a people pleaser either. That's why they crucified him. He pushed all their buttons with the truth, and they hated him. So, a godly leader is not concerned with pleasing men, but instead, verse 4, with pleasing God, who examines our hearts. This calling to a position of authority means that one or a man knows he is always watched by God for accountability. Yeah, but nobody's watching. There's no video cameras. Yeah, there is. He's always watching. A godly leader knows that God's always watching. And so with this, then, this great honor that a godly leader gets to have, wow, I get to be a husband, I get to be a father, wow, I get to be a leader in the church, wow. This great honor comes with great burden of fear and trembling when you serve the creator of the universe. 2 Corinthians 2:3. It's like, wow, that's great to be in that position. Yeah, it's an honor and I feel great. But at the same time, it's with fear and trembling because God's watching and he knows every single thing that you're doing all the time and what you're thinking about. As false accusations come, the accusers will often go after motive when they have nothing else legitimate. In other words, when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, when you're teaching the truth to your family, and when you're living the truth, then the next thing they could go, if they don't have any dirt on you in that way, they're going to say, oh, well, you just did it out of your bad motives because it's invisible and nobody could really see it. So they go after, oh, well, you just did it for this. And that's Paul's accusations against him from Corinth. Oh, well, he just did it for this, or he just did it for that, or he just did it for this. Because they couldn't nail him on his life or what he was saying. They knew that was true. You can't deny it when you see a godly leader living and preaching the truth. All you can say is, well, he's probably this. And so we see this is where false accusations come from. They come from a lack of evidence for anything else, so they go after the invisible stuff that nobody can prove. They go, when they have nothing legitimate, they go after the motive. Paul got most of his accusations from Corinth, and these were what they were based on. And this is an example, 1 Corinthians 4:1. This is what Paul says to them. The two letters dealt with people accusing him that he wrote to Corinth. We know he wrote two other letters that had to do with the same thing that just weren't in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 1 through 5. Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. In this case, moreover, it is required of stewards that one be found trustworthy. But to me, it is a very small thing that I may be examined by you, is what he's saying, or by any human court. In fact, I do not even examine myself, for I am conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not by this acquitted. Just because I don't see any My conscience seems to be clear, and I don't really care what these accusers say. But he says this, but the one who examines me is the Lord. So he's saying, I don't think I've done anything wrong. You guys are liars, but still, just because that still doesn't even, just because I think I'm innocent, that still doesn't cut it. It's, it's the one who examines me as the Lord. Verse 5, therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. He's saying, you have no dirt on me when I'm teaching. You got no dirt on me the way I'm living. And I can't, how can I prove to you my motives? All I know is that my conscience is clear and I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm leaving it up to him to judge me on these things. He said this to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 1. For our proud confidence is this. You notice he says our, because he's not alone. Leaders are going to, or they have a team and they're all going to get slammed. For our proud confidence is this. The testimony of our conscience, that in holiness and godly sincerity, not in fleshly wisdom, but in the grace of God, we have conducted ourselves in the world and especially towards you. He's talking about that he is conducting himself with holiness and godly sincerity towards them, not in fleshly wisdom. And with this, then, a pastor, husband, and father who preaches and lives the truth on the outside will be attacked for his motives on the inside. But, you know this, the inner motives will always show themselves in outer fruit. They will always come out one time. They might come out when you see somebody coming, oh, I can see that guy's motives just by his action. Or others have been around for a while, and then later on you go, oh, I never saw that before. But they will always come out eventually. And Paul and his team had already demonstrated that they had good fruit in the fact that these people were saved and living a godly life. A godly leader knows he has been assigned by God to be entrusted to lead, therefore being accountable to God first above everybody else and be the bad guy. Therefore, a godly leader bears priority in serving God first, and then he also then bears integrity, verse 5. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with the pretext for greed. God is witness, once again, saying, before the Lord I stand fine. We never came with flattering speech. And Jude 1:16 tells us that that's how the false teachers operate, with flattering speech. And flattery means this, to be extraordinarily impressed, to marvel, wonder, and admire in the positive sense, or to be greatly disturbed in the negative sense. In other words, oh, you were just so wonderful. That's flattery in the positive sense. Or, oh, you poor dear, it's just so sad. That's example of the sarcasm that comes through flattery. Basically, most people could see through it, but when somebody's really hurting or really weak emotionally, then they're going to fall for this stuff. But this is what flattery is. And so therefore, flattery is speaking in a manner which appears to be strongly reacting to someone's qualities, sorrow, or sorrows. In this case, Paul talks about for the sake of gaining an advantage. In other words, a false sincerity. We didn't do that. We didn't come here to try to get anything from you. We didn't come here and use flattery. We just told it like it was. And we know Paul tells it like it is because most people don't like Paul. In fact, so many attacks have been against Paul the Apostle that, he wasn't really, his stuff, we need to erase it. Those pages we need to tear out. Because Paul writes all this controversial stuff about women's roles and all these other things that people hate. So he's under attack, but he didn't flatter anybody. He told it like it was. And so the false teachers have this arrogant attitude about using flattery. We see this in 12:4, about God is going to be ripping out. It's going to be Psalms 12:4, 3 and 4, that God's talking about he's going to rip their tongues out because they say this, with our tongue we will prevail. Our lips are our own. Who is Lord over us? They use their lips as a tool for flattery to try to take advantage of people. And God says he's basically going to rip their tongues out. Psalm 12:3 and 4. We never came with flattering speech, nor with a pretext for greed. Pretext is basically a cover-up, in this case, of greed or personal gain. Basically, what we see is a godly leader does not covet something that doesn't belong to him. He's not after something else. Acts 20, 33 and 34. He has no hidden agenda, and Jesus demonstrates this. Mark 10:45, he says this, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life a ransom for many. Jesus didn't get anything fun out of pleasing people. He knew that it would cost him his life, and he came for the benefit of glorifying God and what was best for people. He had no pretext for greed. And Paul, once again in verse 5, God is witness. Basically, knowing that God is witness, the godly leader is only concerned with what God thinks regardless of the accusations. He only cares what God thinks, and he can't care about the accusations. He bears persecution. A godly man bears the integrity to make sure that he is the same on the inside as to what he claims on the outside. With this, he will not compromise, knowing with great fear and trembling that God knows his heart. He knows that God is a witness in all of his thoughts, words, and deeds. So a godly man bears priority in answering to God first, and bears integrity in knowing that God sees all, and that his opinion is what matters the most. A godly man also bears humility. The godly man also bears humility. Verse 6, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. Nor did we seek glory from men. So in verse 4, he talked about being pleasing to men, and now he's talking about seeking glory from men. Being pleasing to men is being popular. He wasn't seeking to be popular with them. Seeking glory from men means seeking praise from men, in the sense of seeking prestige as the top guy. As look at him, how important he is. See, you can go be the popular guy and not be the leader. Hey, he's just the cool guy. And so he's not there to be the cool guy and just pleasing to people, but he's also not there to be, oh, look at Paul, he's the top guy. He's not seeking glory from men. He's not seeking prestige as the top guy, or even bragging about being the top guy or abusing a position of authority. A godly leader does not bring praise to himself, but to God. Paul did the same thing, Romans 11:36. From him and through him and to him are all things, to be the glory forever. Amen. It's all about him. It's what a godly leader does. This whole team did not seek glory or prestige. And here's what we see in verse 6. Even though as apostles of Christ, we might have asserted our authority. In other words, it was possible for them to assert their authority, but they didn't. And the Greek term for asserted, this means able in weight to use that authority. But they opted not to. In other words, they didn't throw their weight around. They didn't use that authority. And we see that as a Pharisee that Paul was, when he was named Saul, he had great authority and great prestige. And he knew it at the time, and he used it, and he threw his weight around, and he was a murderer. But the new man, Paul, now an apostle, which is God-given, way more important authority, because it's God-given as an apostle in the church, yet he didn't play the apostle card with them. He had the ability to and the weight to, but he didn't, it says, because he was born again and therefore knew how to use his authority according to who it came from and how he got it. He knew how to use his authority. He still had it, and we'll see as we move on that, yeah, there's a time when he is going to enforce and use his authority. But he didn't. And we see here that in dealing with the rebellious Corinthians, Paul had to escalate to speaking on his apostolic authority. The whole book of 2 Corinthians is talking about, hey, I'm an apostle, and this is just the way it is, and God gave me this job, and you just got to deal with it and suck it up, because this is what I'm supposed to be doing. He did that with the Corinthians, but with the Thessalonians, the team was able to condescend to their flux level, meaning to put aside their authority and step down to their level. And when they did this, because they did this first, it says, and to see that it would bear much fruit without having to exercise their authority. They started at the bottom of the scale. And even in his introduction in this letter that he wrote to the Thessalonians, Paul did not introduce himself as an apostle like he did with the Corinthians. He didn't need to. He says, it's this letter to the Thessalonians, and he's talking about that it's from Paul, Timothy, and Silas. He doesn't say anything about Paul the apostle, because he didn't need to. A godly leader knows he is placed in a position of authority under God through his grace alone. Now, like I said, Paul did introduce himself as an apostle to the Corinthians and to other places, but he didn't here because he didn't need to. A godly leader knows he is placed in a position of authority under God through his grace alone. He gets it. I'm nobody important. God put me here. It's on him. I'm just trying to follow him. Jesus demonstrates this attitude, which we read early in Philippians chapter 2, when he came to earth as God himself, lowering himself to reach helpless people. Philippians 2, 5 through 8. And along with this authority as pastors, they even had the right for pay. They even had the right for pay. 1 Timothy 5:18 says a pastor deserves pay. But they opted out for the sake of the poverty-stricken community of Thessalonica. They opted out. They did not come on strong and authoritative without first starting at the level of gentleness. So with this, a godly leader trusts in God and his authority without being heavy-handed. To walk into the room and say, look at me, isn't the way to do it. It's to be a servant of God and dealing with things from that level. And so we see, though, at some point the Bible demonstrates many cases where there is an escalation of force against a sinful situation. We're going to see some of those. Yes, there's a time when there needs to be an escalation of authority against a sinful situation. And with this, we know some learn the easy way and some learn the hard way. But we're going to address that in a few weeks. But in all of this, we see how Jesus started out. He started out as the ultimate example of godly leadership like this. You guys know this. It's from Matthew 11. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's not heavy-handed. Jesus came, stooped to the level of messed up people, and offered them this gentle love. And even though, as apostles of Christ, he says, we may have asserted our authority, but instead, in verse 7, they were gentle. As we will see the details of this next time when we get into verse 7. But with this, the godly man bears also confident humility. So we see there that this passage shows three attitudes of a godly leader that should help you to lead and follow according to what role you're in. First of all, verse 4, he bears priority. This is the attitude of putting God first in all things. He bears integrity, which is the attitude of knowing that God sees and knows everything. He bears humility, which is the attitude wanting God's will to be done, bringing glory to him and to the benefit of others, leaving yourself out of this part. So we see then that a godly leader's attitude then, as you know, is foreign to the watching world. It makes no sense, this godly attitude. In this get what you got to get, attitude is everything, dog eat dog, this whole attitude Makes no sense to the world. It is foolishness to the world to make an invisible entity your first priority. I'm just doing this because God wants me to. Who? God. Who's God? Where is he? I don't even see him. And they look at you like you're a fool with that attitude. It is foolishness to the world to live in a manner that has pure motives. The world's going to say, just do, you can just do this because, why would you hurt yourself when you can do this? It's foolishness to have pure motives. The world doesn't get it. It's foolishness to the world to put yourself lower than others. Once again, attitude is everything. You're supposed to be up there, dog eat dog, top dog. Yet, with this as a godly leader, the world is watching, your wife is watching, your kids are watching, and they're watching, if you're a godly leader, what only the power of God can accomplish in your life as a godly leader. It's so crazy to the world, and that everybody's watching. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, it's going to be amazing for everybody watching. And with this, then, be ready to respond to their amazement and answer the questions when they say, how do you think that, what did you come up with this? And with this, why do you have joy? Doesn't make any sense. I'm glad you asked. Be prepared to give a response to their amazement. So this is true leadership. This is practicing the Great Commission. Bringing people to Christ, teaching them to obey his commandments, and leading with your godly example. And these are the marks of a godly leader. Let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father,